English speakers make grammar mistakes all the time, sometimes without realizing they're making them. And often, communication still works. The meaning comes through, the conversation continues, and nothing really breaks down. So the interesting question isn't simply, why are these forms considered incorrect? It's also, why do these forms continue to persist even when the grammatical distinction is clear? In this video, we'll look at 3 common mistakes, how to avoid them, and what they reveal about how language is actually used. Let's start with the mistake so common it appears in places where you might expect the grammar to be carefully checked, like supermarket signs, self-checkout lanes, and in many other everyday situations. You've probably seen 10 items or less. Strictly speaking, it should be 10 items or fewer. Here's why. As a general rule, fewer is used for things that can be counted individually. Less is usually used for things that aren't counted that way, things treated as quantities, amounts, or measurements. So for example, you'd typically say, there are fewer people in the queue today. Conversely, you'd say, there's less traffic this morning. Or compare these, there are fewer water bottles in the fridge, as opposed to, there's less water in the fridge. Both words exist in the same general domain, but they have slightly different grammatical roles. A useful shortcut is this. If you could count the items one by one, or you're describing people, fewer is often the more reliable choice. If you're describing an amount, quantity, or something measured rather than counted individually, less is often the better fit. But there are exceptions. Time, money, and units of measurement often behave a little differently. You may hear less than 5 minutes, less than 10 pounds, less than 15 miles, and those forms are widely accepted. So the distinction is real, but not perfectly rigid. And that helps explain why people blur it, because in the real world, less appears everywhere, even where the countable versus uncountable distinction is clear. Part of the reason is that usage of less can feel more flexible. It applies naturally in many everyday situations, and because of that, it can feel safer to extend into countable situations too. Over time, that flexibility can begin to outweigh precision. Although the rule still exists, usage begins to shift. And once a pattern becomes familiar, it no longer sounds obviously wrong. It simply sounds normal. This pattern occurs frequently. When a simpler form works well enough, it often spreads, even when a more precise distinction exists. And if you want a practical tip, listen for whether you're describing separate things you could count. If you are, pause and test whether fewer fits. Often, it will. Now, for the second mistake, one whose distinction is slowly fading in everyday speech. You've probably heard and likely said something like, who did you give it to? Technically, that should be, whom did you give it to? Here's why. As a general rule, who is used in the subject case for the person performing the action. Whom is used in the object case for the person receiving the action. In this sentence, you is the subject performing the action. You gave something. The person receiving it is the object. So whom is the more appropriate form here, not who. If you're struggling with the distinction, you can use a simple test. Try replacing who or whom in the answer with the pronoun. If the pronoun replacing who or whom in the answer would be a subject pronoun, I, she, he, we, or they, who is usually right. If it would be an object pronoun, me, her, him, us, or them, whom is usually right. For example, start with the question, who did you call? Now, test it. Replace who in the answer with a pronoun. I called him. The pronoun there is him, an object pronoun. So that tells you the more appropriate form would be, whom did you call? Now, compare that with, who called you? Answer, he called. The pronoun there is he, a subject pronoun. So who is right there. It's a surprisingly useful shortcut. But in everyday conversation, many people don't make this distinction consistently. Part of the reason is complexity. During fast speech, tracking subject and object roles can be less practical in real time. And when that distinction becomes cumbersome, people often default to who, not necessarily because they believe it's correct, but because, most of the time, the substitution rarely creates friction, and the speaker is understood despite the error. Interestingly, whom is used routinely in more formal or careful speech, especially in writing, where people have time to think through the structure. And that points to something important. When people don't have to make the distinction in real time, they often make the more appropriate choice. And if you want a practical recommendation, even if you don't use whom consistently in conversation, it's still worth trying to make the distinction in writing, especially in situations where precision matters. A simple safeguard is to use that pronoun test. It catches many cases surprisingly well, and over time, it can make the distinction feel much less intimidating. Now for a third mistake, or really a cluster of related mistakes, all involving first-person pronouns. And unlike the previous examples, this one often involves overcorrection as much as confusion. Let's start with the more common mistake. You may hear something like, "My mother made dinner for my brother and I." Strictly speaking, that should be, "My mother made dinner for my brother and me." Here's why. After a preposition like for, to, or with, English normally calls for an object pronoun. And in this sentence, the pronoun is functioning as part of the object, following the preposition for. So me is the more appropriate choice, not I. A useful test can help here too. To determine whether to use I or me, simplify the sentence by removing the other person. Let's revisit the example. In this case, we remove my brother. You wouldn't say, "My mother made dinner for I." You'd say, "My mother made dinner for me." And that usually tells you what you need to know. Adding another person doesn't change the role of the pronoun. So the pronoun shouldn't suddenly change form. And that's where overcorrection can begin. Now compare that with a different type of error. You may also hear this: "Me and Maya went to the store." Although it's not as common as the previous example, you've probably heard it. Technically, that should be, "Maya and I went to the store," because the pronoun I is one of the subjects of the sentence, one of the people performing the action. And like in the previous example, if you remove the other person and reconsider the sentence, the distinction becomes clearer. You wouldn't say, "Me went to the store," you'd say, "I went to the store." But because the meaning is still clear, this error often passes without much notice. Part of what may be happening here is less about strict rhythm and more about habit and speech patterns. The familiar form gets repeated, and over time, it can begin to sound acceptable. But there's another layer as well, the misuse of the pronoun myself. You might hear something like, "The team and myself prepared this presentation for the workshop today," or "Please contact Nico or myself." In these cases, myself can sound more formal, more careful, possibly even more reliable, and that is often exactly why it appears. But grammatically, myself usually has a different job. It's typically used in the reflexive case, when the subject and object are the same. For example, "I taught myself to play the piano." There, the subject and the object refer to the same person. That's where reflexive pronouns belong. But in the two earlier examples, that isn't what's happening. So myself may sound correct without actually functioning correctly. And that often reflects overcorrection. People sense uncertainty around I and me and reach for a form that feels safer. A quick way to test all three is this. If another person appears in the sentence, remove them and test the pronoun by itself. For example, "My colleague and I went to the conference." Remove "my colleague," and the sentence becomes, "I went to the conference." That works. On the other hand, consider this example. "The guests brought gifts for my husband and I." Remove "my husband" or "I" doesn't work. "For me" does. And finally, if you're tempted to use "myself," ask whether the subject is acting back on itself. If not, the pronouns I or me may be the better choice. We've looked at 3 common mistakes English speakers make, and across all 3, a similar pattern appears. Simpler forms can spread because they're flexible, distinctions can fade through habit, and uncertainty can invite overcorrection. These patterns aren't random. They reflect how language adapts to the way people actually use it. In practice, people don't always use language according to the rules. They also adapt according to habit, ease, and repeated usage. In everyday communication, meaning doesn't depend on perfect grammar. Often, meaning survives through context, through convention, through what sounds clear or familiar enough to be understood. That doesn't mean grammatical distinctions don't matter. They often do, especially in writing and when precision matters. While knowing how to avoid these mistakes is useful, understanding why they persist can be equally interesting. Because language isn't only a system of rules and structure, it's also a system of habits. Habits that are repeated, adjusted, and gradually accepted as normal. And noticing those patterns can tell us something deeper about how language actually works.